Good afternoon, my family and friends. To all 422 family members, from me and Colin, welcome to the shed of eternal horror. Today I'm going to give you another short story from the book I showed you yesterday, the Ordo Strigoi V, which I wrote and self-published through Amazon. And this story is a creature who I created myself, and the name of the creature is the Shemilt. And the story goes like this. I had rented a room for the summer in a foreboding looking house which had the name of Craigie Moor. It is in an elevated position on a rocky promontory set back from the road. The house is on the coastline overlooking Porthy Afon, which is west of Triada Bay in North Wales, on the beautiful island of Anglesey. It is a large austere house in the neo-Georgian style. The roof is of grey slate with lichen growing on it. Its tall rectangular chimneys stretch upwards to touch the sky. Its dark wood window frames surrounding leaded windows add to the air of mystery. The house seems to exude a great deal of mystery. The house looms out of the darkness and has a cold and foreboding look, particularly from the road as you drive along the coast towards Holyhead. And it would befit any of the mansions seen in the Hammer horror films. I had rented the room for the solitude and the beauty of the surrounding area, as I was hoping to write a book which had been floating around my mind for months. The location lent itself to so much possibility for writing, and certainly provided food for thought. I tried to set the mood within the room by lighting a few candles, hoping to create an atmosphere of suspense. I opened the French window which led out onto a small balcony which overlooked the Irish Sea. I sat on a chair and gazed out into the darkling night. I noticed how still it was that night, just the gentle sound of waves breaking upon the beach below, along with the sound of shingles as they were washed by the seawater. There was a slight breeze that night which entered the room, causing the candles to flicker. Their smoke danced like spirits in the eerie light, which painted images of ghosts within my mind. After all, this house must have its own past occupants, remaining within the very fabric of the building. The moon hung quite low in the sky, and its reflection could be seen in the calm waters of Porthy Afon. The occasional cloud floated by, hiding the moon occasionally, which all led to that perfect atmosphere, and one that I was certain would be conducive to putting pen to paper. I sat there for quite a while with all manner of thoughts going around my head. A feeling of peace had surrounded me. Everything was setting the perfect scene for me to start my book. It was so nice to be on the balcony. I decided to collect my pens and paper and to start writing. After all, I was out there in the peace of my surroundings. I put pen to paper and began to scribble down notes with the occasional doodle. Ideas were coming thick and fast, but there was one idea that would not go away. and it just kept on popping back into my mind. Perhaps this would be the beginning of a bestseller. I continued to write, and the words seemed to flow from my pen with ease. Everything was so perfect. Then suddenly, a blood-curdling scream could be heard coming from the direction of the bay. I climbed back in through the window and put my shoes on and grabbed my flashlight before going down the staircase towards the front door. I followed the path walking towards the cliff edge and another pathway leading down onto the beach. I held my flashlight and scanned it across the beach and along the cliff edge, but to no avail. I could not see or hear anything. The quietness returned, and I went back to my room trying to work out in my mind just what I might have heard. Soon the night and the fresh air lulled me into a deep sleep. I awoke in the morning and went down to the beach again, and there were no signs to say that anything could have happened. The scream was the sound that I will remember for a long time. My mind was working overtime, trying to imagine just what it was that I had heard that night before. As I walked around the bay, I came across several caves which all seemed to go a long way into the surrounding cliffs, each one dripping water and smelling of the sea with much seaweed washed into their gaping mouths. As I entered the caves, I had a feeling that I was not alone. I looked around, but I saw nobody. I walked further into the cave and could hear what sounded like an animal growling. So I decided to make my way out of the cave, and as I did, something shot past my leg and out onto the beach. Suddenly there it was, its tail. Then from behind me I heard a voice calling, "Where are you, George?" George was a rather good-looking Staffordshire bull terrier. The voice was his owner, who had emerged from the darkness within the cave. "Hello there," he said. "I hope old George didn't scare you." We began to chat, and he told me that he lived on the island of Anglesey, and he inquired what I was doing there. I explained to him that I was an author who had hired a room in Craigie, as I was hoping to write a new book. He told me that he had a lot of knowledge about the house and the area, and if I needed any information, he would be willing to help me out. George continued to wag his tail and grumbled with impatience. He wanted to continue his daily walk. The man told me that his name was Andrew. He gave me his address and phone number, saying, "If I can help you with anything at all, just let me know." I returned to my room and sat on the balcony once again to try and write, but my mind kept on going back to that awful scream that I heard. Andrew seemed to stutter a little before telling me that what I had heard would be the Shemilt. I had no idea what he was talking about. Again he stuttered and said, The Shemilt is a creature of Celtic legend, and it is said to wander the shores of Ynys Cubi. Many have heard its terrible scream, but only a handful of people have ever seen it, and those people are very reluctant to talk about it. He told me that he knew of a man called Wyn Lewis, who had claimed to have seen the Shemilt, and he promised that he would take me to see him. This time away had so far taken me away from my writing, because of one thing and another. But I dare not miss this meeting with someone who had seen the legendary creature. Deep in my mind, I knew that this creature would consume my thoughts and would become my new book. Perhaps this would be the bestseller that I had always dreamed of. I arranged with Andrew to go and see this old gentleman in his home in Llangoch, a small place in the shadow of Anglesey Mountain, overlooking the busy port of Holyhead. I was filled with a sense of wonder as Andrew drove along the road towards the house where Wyn had lived all his life. Eventually we arrived at the cottage and walked down the path through a rose-covered archway which led to an ancient studded door in the centre of what was a double-fronted cottage. It had old mullion windows. The exterior was painted white, which was so very bright in the morning sun. With anticipation, I knocked on the door with the dragon door knocker. After what seemed an age, the old door creaked open, and there stood Wyn, who welcomed us into his home. The inside was quite dark, with a glow of an old peat-burning fire, giving light out into the room. I could see that Wyn was of advanced age by the depth of the wrinkles on his face, and selfishly hoped that he would remember what he could about his meeting with the Shemilt. He offered us a seat and a drink. We all sat in the glow of the fire and began to introduce ourselves. Wyn got out some tobacco and rubbed it between his gnarled hands before packing into his pipe. He then lit the pipe, and Wyn blew the smoke towards the ceiling. "Right, what do you want to know?" he said. His tale began with him being a much younger man who was a lobster fisherman around the coastline of Ynys Cubi. He was out potting for lobsters every day, whenever the weather permitted, and sometimes when it was not so good. His weathered face told a story in itself of a hard life working within the elements. Wyn told me that while he was out on his boat setting the lobster pots, that he had often heard the scream, which had been attributed to the Shemilt. But he, along with other fishermen, always laughed it off, thought it was a trick of a mind, only the sound of the wind and the waves as they rushed through the tortured and twisted granite rock. None of them had really taken any notice. They thought it was just a folklore, a legend created by the fishermen, as many of them have been lost at sea, and their superstitious minds had created a monster as the cause of the many shipwrecks that had occurred in centuries past. Wyn continued to tell me that the screams went by unheeded, and they carried on with their daily work along the shoreline. This was until one dark day, excuse me, I'm being pestered by a fly. I'll carry on now. The dark day was the 8th of November, the year was 1957. The sea was rougher than normal, and the wind blew in almost gale force, not the best conditions to be a fisherman. But there was a living to be made and a family to be fed. The sea grew choppier and the screams grew louder. Wyn said he took no notice and carried on lifting his lobster pots, hoping for a good catch. Out of nowhere came a large wave that battered his small boat, driving it towards the coast and a bay called Moryen. The wind increased, and Wyn was helpless against it. His boat smashed into the rocks and sank into the dark waters of the bay. Wyn told me that he had just managed to fight the waves and was able to drag his weary body up onto the beach. Breathless and cold he sat down on a rock, and he thanked his lucky stars that he had survived. It was then that he said he heard a terrible scream coming from a nearby cave. He was unnerved, but thought about the wind and waves crashing through the rocks and thought nothing else about it. Looking out across the bay, he sighed, and his mind wandered, and he thought about what had happened, and how on earth he would be able to make a living now that his beloved boat had gone. He told me that it was at this point that he noticed something moving in the entrance of the cave. Thinking it was just driftwood or some other washed-up item, he averted his gaze and slowly stood up. He was still a little unsteady on his legs, and he began to walk across the sand, stumbling. Occasionally as he went, he fell. Again he noticed something moving as it was alive in the mouth of the cave. Slowly he walked over towards the cave, then stopped dead in his tracks, as whatever it was stood up and let out an ear-piercing scream. Thinking it may be another wounded fisherman, he carried on towards the cave to see if there was anyone in there who needed his help. Again a scream stopped him dead. Whatever it was now walking back into the cave. He decided that he would follow to what it was that was causing that scream. The Shemilt was the furthest thing from his mind as he entered the cave mouth. Slipping on the wet rocks and seaweed, he slowly made his way deeper into the murky darkness. There was a most unpleasant smell in the cave, and he noticed that the cave floor was littered with bones, which he thought would be the remains of a dolphin or a seal. The cave walls began to take on an eerie texture, with strange shapes draped in seaweed everywhere. The smell grew even stronger, and he said he began to feel sick. Then from out of the darkness another scream so loud that it deafened him momentarily. He called out, asking who was there and did they need any help. The storm outside the cave was growing stronger, and Wynne knew he only had a limited time to get out of there, so in desperation he called out once again, and he heard movement, and stood less than 10 yards away from him was a creature, the like of which he had never seen before. The creature stood around 8 feet tall, and he could see that it had very dark skin and webbed hands. The creature screamed loudly. Wynne stumbled his way out of the cave, falling against the walls and into the strange shapes covered in seaweed. As he stumbled into one, it came away from the wall, and there, wrapped as though in a cocoon, was the decomposing body of a man. He found decomposing remains of men, women and children, and the tales of old flooded his mind of the legend of the Shemilt. He ran as fast as he could across the beach, through the bushes and brambles which ripped his clothing and his flesh. The nettles stung him. Behind him he once again heard the scream. This time it was getting much closer. Finally he got off the beach and found himself on Holyhead Road. Luckily for him, although the road was normally very quiet, a car appeared over the hill. Breathless he flagged it down, and the driver kindly gave him a lift, took him to the hospital at Penrose. The nurses cleaned his wounds and calmed him down before a doctor came to see him. Wynne told the doctor what had happened. The doctor, of course, did not believe him and told him it was the effect of delirium caused by the swallowing of seawater. Wynne went home and related the story to his wife, just the same story that he had relayed to me. He was visibly shaken by the recollection of this story. I thanked him and left with Andrew, who drove me back to Craigiemoor. On the journey back, Andrew asked me any thoughts that I had. I told him that I was fascinated and thought it a wonderful idea for a book. Then I remembered Wyn's last words to me: "Whatever you do, do not go down to the beach at Moryen." Moryen Beach was just a short walk away from where I was staying, and my interest had been heightened by Wyn's story, especially as it had the makings of a great horror story. My mind went to a book launch, interviews with the press, possibility that the book could become a blockbuster film. I had for a while believed that the horror world had grown tired of its usual monsters and slashers. The Shemilt of Wyn's warning was still ringing in my ears. I opened the French windows of my room again and sat on the balcony. The night air was fresh, and the gentle breaking of the waves below were a far cry from the storm Wyn had endured that night. I poured myself a glass of rum, and I slowly slipped on it as my mind was working overtime. I would sleep on it and decide what to do in the morning. The night was largely a restless night, and I was unable to get from my mind Wyn's story. Drifting off to sleep, then waking up hearing the screaming in my head. The Shemilt had certainly whetted my appetite. I walked into Triada Bay and had a lovely Welsh breakfast in the Sea Shanty Cafe. As I ate, I gazed out across the bay in deep thought. It was then I made the decision to ignore Wyn's warning. After breakfast, I walked back to Craigiemoor, collected my pens, notebook and camera, and set off to find Moryen Cove. There was a chill wind in the air as I made my way on that coastal road. The fresh, salt sea air would be good for me and blow the cobwebs of the last few days away. I came to an opening in the hedge, which was largely overgrown, just as Wyn had described it, with bushes, brambles and nettles. I gingerly made my way through the overgrown path, with torn trousers and scratched legs and nettled hands. I got through and stood at the entrance to the beach. The beach was strewn with driftwood seaweed and assorted pieces of rubbish all washed in by the tide. Within 10 yards of walking onto the beach, I found the decomposing remains of a grey seal, its mouth in a contorted state with teeth exposed, where seagulls had feasted upon its carcass. I looked out across the bay, which was quite calm, and I tried to imagine that night in November, which had almost brought about the demise of Wyn. As I looked down the cliffs, I noticed that there were several caves. Each one looked foreboding. Each one dripping with water. I tried to look into the gloom within them, but knew that it would not be possible. As when in the light it is impossible to see into the dark, but anything which is stood in the darkness can clearly see into the light. With trepidation I made my way towards the first cave. The tide was going out, so I knew I had plenty of time, and perhaps even solved the legend of the Shemilt. I believed within my mind that this would be a great book, perhaps that one good book that everyone is supposed to hold within them. I began to remember the story of the decomposing remains of people, the terrible screaming monster and almost turned back, but my hunger to put myself where Wyn had stood was overwhelming. So there I was, stood in the mouth of one of the caves. The cave was dark and dank, not tempting at all, and as I entered I was walking over driftwood, seaweed and rubbish left behind by visitors to the coast. Fewer beer cans, wine bottles, McDonald's burger boxes. The cave smelled. Seaweed clung to the walls. The pebbles underfoot made it difficult to walk. As I got to the rear of the cave, it suddenly became very small, with the roof only inches from the floor. There were no sign of bones, no strange shapes clinging to the walls, just an awful smell that pervaded my nostrils. I sighed and made my way out of the cave, blinking as I entered the daylight. I moved on to the next cave, and again the entrance was littered with driftwood and seaweed. The same dark dankness awaited me. Icy cold water dropped from the roof and down the collar of my shirt, which made me shiver. I walked further into the cave, staring at the walls. As I made my way into the darkness, I saw nothing to worry about, but this cave smelled even worse than the first one. Underfoot were the rotting remains of some jellyfish. Not pleasant at all, it was so bad it made me retch. The cave narrowed again and became smaller and smaller. I turned to make my way out and I heard what sounded like a distant scream. Putting it out of my mind, I walked out onto the beach again and took some deep breaths of the salt sea air. Becoming disillusioned, I sat for a while and wondered if old Wyn's story was just a tale that he liked to tell his family and people in the community. I entered the third cave, which was bigger than the others, a large gaping mouth which had been carved deep into the cliff by the erosion of time. I had to wade through a rock pool in order to enter the cave. Crabs scattered under small rocks. Fish darted past my ankles. Finally I was there at the entrance, gazing into the darkness, and I heard a growl. Fully expecting to see George and Andrew there, but I did not, so I put it down to the wind and waves. A short way into the cave I came across some bones which looked like ribs, and vertebrae, which I suppose could have been from a seal. The smell once again was terrible. I felt ill. The stench was gut-wrenching. The walls now started to take on a different appearance, with strange shapes hanging there wrapped in seaweed. My heart began to race, remembering what Wyn had said. I carefully walked past them just in case I disturbed them. Another growl in the darkness created a fear in me, but my logical mind told me not to be ridiculous. The Shemilt was just a legend after all. I convinced myself that all would be well, and I walked further into the cave. I noticed that on the cave floor there were items of clothing, bags, and right in the middle was a camera. Whose was it? How long had it been there? What would be on it? My heart began to race again as I heard a noise in the darkness, a kind of shuffling noise, as though someone or something was coming towards me. A large figure emerged from the gloom, far too big to be a human. It had large eyes and scaly body with webbed hands and feet. I turned to run from the cave, and as I did I heard a terrible deafening scream coming from behind me. As I ran I stumbled, falling into the cave wall, and through a seaweed cocoon caused contents to fall to the floor, and what I saw made me feel so nauseous. Right there on the cave floor was a corpse staring up at me. Its sardonic smile was hideous, its eyes still wide open, showing the fear that it experienced before its death. Savage bites were on the victim's neck, deep scratches raked across the torso. I ran again only to fall into the walls of the cave, and this time the shock of what I witnessed will stay with me until the grave. There, cocooned in the seaweed, were the mortal remains of Andrew. The man who had after all introduced me to Wyn, the source of the current mess I was in. I made my way towards the light of day, and there, right behind me, was the sound of growling. My heart momentarily stopped beating. I thought that I was to be the next victim of the Shemilt. Something hit my leg very hard. I closed my eyes and prayed for a merciful death. Then a strange eerie silence fell within the confines of the cave walls. Was I to be spared this terrible fate? The fate that had befallen the poor innocents who hung from the walls? Once again something hit my leg quite hard, and I heard the growl, which was amplified by the natural acoustics within the cave. I was only yards from the cave entrance. The daylight was quite blinding. I heard another growl. I stumbled out onto the beach, scarcely daring to move. I lay there for a while trying to get to grips with my mind of what I had seen. I closed my eyes and thanked God for saving my mortal soul from the monster that dwelt within the cave. Suddenly, I felt something crawling up my body. A feeling of wet coldness touched my cheek, and I thought, this is it. My time is up. And then there was another growl. As I opened my eyes, there stood George, Andrew's dog. He wagged his tail and snuggled close to me. I wondered what horrors he had witnessed. I stroked his head and made my way off the beach with George following. Since that day, I have forgotten all about writing a horror story, and I have devoted my life to George and he to me. We have become inseparable. My life's work is now to warn everyone of the monster known as the Shemilt, who dwells in a cave on Moryen beach. Most people think I am crazy, but I know what I witnessed. The Shemilt is a very real being, and I beg everyone who reads my story, stay well away from that beach at Moryen. Never ever enter the caves there. If you do, you may not be as lucky as me, and you may end up on the cave wall cocooned in seaweed. I have been called by many people crazy. What do you think? And that is it, my brothers and sisters. If you've liked what you've heard, please leave a comment in the box below. Hit the bell icon that says like. Hit the bell icon for any future uploads. And above all, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please do so. Costs you absolutely nothing, helps the channel grow, and we become part of that bigger family. And on that point, my friends, namaste. And may your God go with you.